There's been a lot of talk recently about political risk. And traditionally, people talk about emerging markets, which tends to mean NOCs, as politically risky. But anybody who's working in the UK today knows that, in the oil sector, knows that political risk can happen in developed countries, it can happen in Australia, it can happen in North America, and it can happen in Britain. So can we just talk a bit about that, perhaps? Who has a question? There's one at the back there, I think.
Hello, it's Tom Bergen from Reuters. I have a question for Bob. It's not so much about political risk, though, I would say. It's about safety. Bob, you mentioned there about things you're doing in safety, and it seemed that the specifics you gave focused on the BOP and the contractor oversight. But when I talk to your, and indeed, publicly, your rivals have focused more on your own drilling procedures when they were explaining events last year. So I'm just wondering if you could tell me a little bit specifically about what you've done to maybe improve your own drilling procedures. And I'm specifically looking at areas like the use of single-string wells in high-pressure, high-temperature wells, and single barriers, relying upon single barriers, and also about setting lockdown sleeves. If you can tell us if there's been any change there. Thank you.
So, Tom, hi. I think I picked up most of that. I think I was a little not clear up here, but you talked about our specific changes in the area of drilling. I did speak about the blowout preventer, which is the absolutely essential device as a barrier to a blowout. But in addition to that, of course, cementing, which has been an issue in the investigations of the Macondo well. We have brought now in-house capability of cementing oversight, inspecting contractors, making sure that our selection of cement is much more rigorous in working with that. The event, I believe the event in the Gulf of Mexico was multi-party, multi-causal. There was lack of judgment from time to time in a chain. It was an extremely complicated accident where as many as 7 things went wrong in a sequence that one could probably never predict. It's similar when there's an aircraft accident. You usually learn that there is anywhere between 4 and 6 events occur rather than one that causes an accident. So we're trying to pull that apart, share those learnings. We broadly accept the findings of the Presidential Commission on the accident. In terms of the company, we are stepping back and evaluating every well that we drill, single organization. There's a whole variety of things I won't go into here in terms of the capability that we're taking and the care that we're taking before we drill any well. I believe that what this will lead to in a decade, and it may take a decade, is that we will see a new generation of blowout preventers that can be operated at higher temperatures, 20,000 psi pressures. Today, the limit is around 15,000 psi. I think you'll see as a result of this, the industry move to another level. But it will take some time, and it will take some of the best minds of companies and service companies and engineers to do that.
Question over there on the left.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Dominic Mays. I'm from Stexo, and I have a question for Mr. Dudley. You made it very clear that BP has launched a very ambitious investment plan. But as CEO, do you also plan to invest heavily in people-related programs, including maybe wellness, quality of life programs for BP's employees?
I was asked by our board 2 months ago, what was the thing that kept me up at night? Of course, there's several things, but one of them was capability in the business. The oil and gas industry and the energy industry, I think it's also similar in the mining industry, particularly oil and gas. One of the greatest challenges not only BP faces, but I think anybody in this room with an NOC or an IOC is capability. The demographics of our industry are such that an enormous amount of experience and talent will be retiring in the next 5 to 7 years. It's quite striking. There was 15 years in the world where few people went into oil and gas. There's a younger generation that's very talented and energetic, but that experience is something that I'm deeply concerned about. So the development of capability in the oil and gas industry is absolutely at the top of our priority. And if we're going to develop 16 projects that bring on, 32 projects that bring on 1 million barrels a day in the next 5 years, you can imagine how we're working to develop people capability and bringing new talent into the company to be able to do that. I think your question goes beyond that and how we're working with people. I missed the exact definition of it, but trying to develop talent across all our functions is part of what we do through large, consistent training programs as well. I'm sure Chevron does the same thing. KOC does, I know, as well.
Gentleman over there with the pink tie.
Easy to be spotted, yeah. Danny O'Sullivan from Energy Intelligence. Kind of to all the panel. Someone told me earlier this week, especially in light of what we might call the Arab Spring, that what the MENA region producers really need to do in terms of developing their society is far more local content, particularly in procurement, simple stuff, manufacturing simple stuff like tubulars, piping, high-pressure vessels, etc. And someone was saying, you know, if they could get up to 20% local content across the MENA region, that would really be something and make a big difference. Now, of course, you know, people from Brazil sitting in here are imposing local content on their developments, and companies like BG are embracing it. I'd like to know from Sami if he thinks there's potential for that kind of development in the Middle East, in Kuwait and in the wider region, and from the IOC gentleman up there, you know, is this, as some other people have said to me, a risk to your business if companies start imposing that kind of local procurement, you know, requirement? Thanks.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to address the question in relation to Kuwait in particular. I think the local content is important for us in Kuwait, and it's mainly for employment of nationals. That is an essential part. We are taking it gradually. We don't have restrictions on expatriates. However, there are percentages specified in the different contracts. It reaches up to 25% in certain categories of jobs. So that is the local content with regard to employment. With regard to procurement, the issue is different because we do not manufacture many equipments or commodities within Kuwait. However, whenever we have a local factory, for example, that produces equipment, they are given an advantage over the others. And is not much. So just to sum up, I think the local content within Kuwait, in my opinion, is not that drastic like other countries elsewhere, really. So most important is employment, and for the commodities and products and equipment that we have, plants or factories within Kuwait, that they have a slight advantage. I don't know if Bob or Jay would like to add.
Yeah, I think Sami's addressed a number of the local content issues. It's very important, no matter where you work, to make sure you cause job creation. The question a lot of times is making sure it's sustainable job creation. The worst thing is the cyclical things. And so a lot of times it means non-oil and gas jobs. So it wouldn't necessarily be a commodity like tubulars for the oil and gas industry, because projects get drilled, 200 or 300 wells, then there's no drilling for 4 or 5 years, and that sort of thing. And so what you need to do is make sure that job creation is something that the local community embraces as jobs that they see as sustainable and fits within the culture of the local environment. But I can tell you that linkage and that overall way to address that hearts and minds of the local people is key to have a sustainable project development model anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East.
Gentleman in front there.
Fernando from Petrobras, Brazil. I think my question pretty much goes to Bob Dudley. Of course, we have partnerships in the Gulf with BP and Chevron. Tiber has been a major strike, yeah. But I think my question is, the concept of BP is to adopt the new standards of BOE MRE and to spread around the world, or you're going to operate according to each country's legislation?
Yeah, it's a good question. The question was, will BP adopt the standards and regulations, the BOEM, which is the new regulatory body in the U.S., and use those and apply them around the world? Actually, no. We will certainly meet the standards of the BOEM when we work in the United States. In some places, we're going to operate above those standards because that's what we feel is the right thing for us to do. But we're not going to take one regulatory body and say that should be the standard everywhere we operate. But I can assure you our minimum standards for operation are going to be high. They'll certainly work with the Brazilian authorities and meet those standards. In some cases, we may do more. But for our point in our evolution and our history and the survival of the company and what I think is a deep responsibility of BP to take what we've learned from this, we're going to take that around the world and operate how we feel the most comfortable with, always within the regulatory standards of where we operate.
Thank you. Do I see any more questions out there? I'm not seeing a great many hands leaping up. There's one out there.
Hi, sorry, it's Tom Bergen from Reuters again.
Go on, Tom.
I have a question about Oman, Bob. You talked a little bit about Oman there. Could you expand about that and also about a possible increase in spending plans there? Thanks.
Yeah, Tom, the question is Oman, and I believe His Excellency Rumi may be here in the room as the Energy Minister. BP has been working there to unlock some very tight gas from in Oman, and has gone into the desert and opened up some of those wells and done some of the tools and techniques on them that have produced high rates of production from 3 wells now. If we can make this economic and the well flow rates are holding up, it could be a very, very big project. We're going to sit down and talk about the economics of the project and gas pricing because it's an expensive process. We'll be making a decision on that project next year to take it to the next level. So I think probably next spring's the right time to ask on the specifics, Tom. But we're very enthusiastic about it.
Thank you. Any more questions? A gentleman there with the stripy, is it a stripy tie or is that your tag?
Yeah, this is a question about Nick Holloway with IHS. A question about the industry and its relationship with the media, perhaps. And we had a very spirited presentation yesterday from Philip Lambert about how in terms of trying to convince governments that natural gas is an extremely important fuel to think about switching to in terms of carbon dioxide generation, and how on the industry side there's silence and on the government side there's deafness. I just wonder whether the industry is thinking about its strategy of trying to do a better job of getting the media to relate to the industry and project that out to the general public.
There's a strange question about the media. Go ahead, Bob.
BP, we don't know much about the media. I think what I would say, Nick, is that what you raise here is something that's fundamentally happening very, very quickly in terms of natural gas. And I believe that natural gas is developing a reputation of somehow being unsafe, particularly in the northeast of the U.S. around the fracking techniques. Legislation in France has banned fracking. There's interventions occurring around the world in the search for unconventional gas now. I think it's a fascinating process that has come very, very fast, like much of the 24-hour media cycle does now, that is quite threatening to the energy industry and the gas industry in particular. The beneficiary of that will be the coal industry, because that's what people will replace what could be gas unlocked. I haven't seen it, but I understand there's a film in the U.S. called Gasland. And I don't know if anybody's seen it here. I'm told I should watch it. It's up for an Academy Award in the U.S., and it portrays fracking and shale gas as having gas coming out of the taps in your home, and the dangers of this, the dangers to the drinking water. That has, I'm told it has sort of the impact of watching the film Inconvenient Truth on global warming. It feels to me like the oil and gas industry is way behind a public campaign that is against gas. I don't think it's healthy. I've talked about it in China and several places who are quickly now trying to learn more about this and the media campaigns here, because they're very unbalanced. And I think it's a point for everybody in the room who has tight gas and uses the techniques of fracking, which have been around for 50 or 60 years in the world. And I've never heard of the kinds of problems that are being portrayed as a real threat to the industry. And I have to say, remember, gas is the most clean-burning fuel. It has half of the emissions of coal. So this is a point, as may not be exactly what you were raising here, but I think it's something the industry ought to get on very, very quickly.
Jay, would you like to take on that one?
Yeah, I'll join Bob in that one. I think to point out Gasland and the picture that's shown is actually a coal seam that's actually causing that tap to burn. The state of Colorado did a study and pulled up the data. So what it tells me, a lot of times we have discussions without being very data driven. We look at a lot of emotion. And I think our industry has to push forward and talk about and put in the public domain more information. There's been a reluctance in our industry to put forward the components of fracking fluid and those sort of things. We have to get around that. We have to go forward and put those types of things in the public domain so public gets to see the data. And once the data's in that public domain, it makes that discussion a lot easier, and facts a lot of times speak for themselves. But I think the relationship with the media is a little bit about what you're talking about. And I think as an industry, we've been very competitive. BP, Chevron, we compete. We really do on a daily basis, along with the NOC partners around the world for that resource. It's hard. It's a struggle to keep developing the resource necessary for society. So we've got to, on certain areas like this, need to come together and begin to work together a little more to be straightforward and put those kind of pieces of information in the public domain for the press to use to help to educate our global society about its trade-offs as we go forward.
I can see a question just there. Gentleman there. Is your
Good
mic
morning.
working? No.
My name is Alexander Majid. I'm from African Petroleum. We're a West African-focused oil and gas exploration company. This question is more to Mr. Pryor. Chevron have a few assets in West Africa and I believe planning to drill there fairly soon. I wanted to know Mr. Pryor's view on West Africa as becoming one of the next major oil-producing regions in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you probably read my bio. I lived in Nigeria for 4 years, so I worked the coast of Africa quite extensively. We obviously think West Africa has a lot of resources, along with some of my associates who are also exploring in that general area. Just as our industry does, we get hot and cold in certain basins. And being a petroleum engineer, we do a lot of technical work and look at those things. And I think as technology has progressed, it has again opened up a resurgence in West Africa, especially in the deeper Cretaceous basins. A lot of wells being drilled, good success. Next to where there's offshore will be, I think, more gas basins. So a lot of the oil is being looked at now, but I think gas is the future probably in a lot of those basins.
Another question at the back there, I think.
Yes, good morning. Johannes Benini from JBC. I have a question for Mr. Pryor and Mr. Dudley about Russia. Russia tries very hard to bring investors back in, tries to improve the investment climate. At least this is what appears to be their incentive. The question is, how well are they doing? We see their expectations still half a year ago about their own production was looking very pessimistic. Right now they're playing with ideas to lower their export duties, eventually giving some incentives elsewhere. Now you're on the front row, so to say. Can you give us an impression how you feel about the initiatives of the Russian leadership to attract foreign investment in the oil and gas sector?
So thank you. Jay and I were just in St. Petersburg Friday, which was the economic forum in St. Petersburg, where the leadership as Russia was there. I think we both talked to many of the leaders. Dmitry Medvedev was there, Igor Sechin, the heads of the Russian oil companies. I mean, it was very clear that there is a mood and a recognition that they want to develop partnerships. They want to move forward. They want new things to happen. They want new inward investment. There was a great deal of talk about privatizing parts of the Russian state oil company, Rosneft. I mean, I think they do want investment and partnerships. We've had an interesting time there. We have had a business in Russia for some time. It's been a very successful partnership. We proposed a novel concept, which was a partnership with Rosneft, a cross-holding to begin to spend what would be billions in a long, long time on 3 exploration blocks in the Arctic. It would probably be about 15 to 20 years of investment before revenues. That has not worked out. There's been various barriers to that. So I think that some things happened which surprised me in terms of progress. But I think that the intent is there. Clearly, Russia is now producing more than Saudi Arabia, more than 10 million barrels a day. They have onshore a lot of old infrastructure and old fields that will need additional work, secondary recovery, EOR for the future. It's got a good future. I mean, I think they are working to try to get the policies up. I would not have thought that Russian production would have been able to cross the 10 million barrel a day mark as it has. So some good things happening there. Want to add anything, Jay?
No, I think Bob's hit most of the points, but I think the business environment has been the key, and certainly have seen improvement. We, like BP, have been partners with Russian entities since the early 90s with Transneft, Rosneft, Lukoil. I think they're also looking outside the country, so their appetite has moved from not just Russia-centric to outside, and as an oil company, as you move into lots of different places around the world, you find out a lot of things about yourself. And so I think sometimes a lot of the changes aren't just in the political arena, it's the companies, as they've got to partner with different people outside of their own country, they begin to understand what it takes to partner with people in their own country. So I truly believe a lot of this progress has come because of their initiatives in addition to their work inside the country.
Question on the left there, gentlemen. Oh, sorry,
Yes.
I've been overruled. You?
Okay. Paul Zeff, the question is on climate change. This was a graph shown in the Kuwait presentation, and there was also the question about standards around the world, for instance, for BP's drilling. Currently, there doesn't seem to be any standard for climate change. Europe has made the most dramatic statement, and the US seems to be stalled. So I wonder, for each of the panelists, how do you approach the issue of climate change and emissions in different countries with the variety of standards?
Hello, yeah. Again, I'll talk about Kuwait in particular, and maybe in the region, in the Arabian Gulf region. Specifically, we don't have standards for, of course, for global warming as such. However, we have in Kuwait, Kuwait EPA, that they have standards for emissions at refineries, oil fields, and that we have to comply with. So we do have standards for emissions for the oil industry within Kuwait. And I believe it's the same within the Gulf area, the Arabian Gulf area is the same. So that is what we have so far. Of course, we have a program for CO2 capturing, and we have a program we are developing. In fact, I would like to mention here that in Kuwait Oil Company, we have done tremendous effort in reducing the gas flaring. Just to mention an example, 5 years ago, it used to be 17%. Today, as we speak, we reached 1.7% of the gas which we flare. Our target next year that we will be 1%, and then later on we'll go to up to the technical limits. In fact, some of our fields, like the Burgan field, we reached 0.22%, which is near a residential area. So really we are focusing on that, on the gas flaring as one of the main sources. Yeah, thank you.
I think the other dimension you asked about was the regulatory side. And even though there's not a lot of current progress in the U.S., we're from the state of California, and we're leading the way in a lot of that regulation. But in Chevron, we look at a process because you really need to make investments longer term in our business. So the current regulation isn't really the driver. It's where do you think regulation is going to be over the life of your investment. So we've put in place some carbon cost and some carbon related metrics within our economics and our project management process. So we look at those future possibilities as we evaluate new investments around the world, not just in the U.S. And we vary sometimes a little bit the cost between an investment just to see what difference it has. But we use the same one globally. So it's not like we use special carbon costs by region.
Go ahead.
Sean Wheeler from Booz & Company. A related question, I think. Some of the most interesting statistics we heard this morning were about the low proportion alternative energy plays currently in the energy mix. But a second statistic, which is around aggressive growth. And I wonder whether each of the gentlemen would comment on alternative energy from a technology perspective and also from the perspective of your upstream strategies in the coming years. Thank you.
So I think it is related, and I'll footnote to what Paul's question is. There is a patchwork of regulation around the world. There doesn't seem to be the joining up in terms of global policies quite yet. And if you look at the projected case of Copenhagen, or getting to the 450 parts per million of CO2 by 2050, we're far off of that trajectory as a globe, primarily because of the great growth in China and Asia and the coal consumption. 1.8 to 7%, that's a growth, or the share of a market that an overall market is growing. So that's a tremendous amount of growth in the renewable energy sites in only 19 years from now. As a company, we and I know all the companies have, we've experimented by trying to learn which kinds of alternative energies can be part of our future in a way that's sustainable and economic for our shareholders. Part of that is through R&D, and part of it's through real investments. BP has had a solar company for 35 years, and a large one. We've found it difficult to make PV cells and manufacture, given the high rates of construction in China. We are now focusing on two areas of renewables. Wind, have about 1.5 gigawatts in the US and a land bank of 20. We, as a company, believe we can manage the projects at scale And we try not to rely on government subsidies with the kinds of investments we make, because this field is littered with subsidies that have been withdrawn. We want them to be economic longer term. And then biofuels, we believe the mandates in California will extend to the rest of the United States. So biofuels in Brazil are economic without subsidies. And we see as a company who markets fuel and will blend that, it fits into our long wavelength operations with a policy of making sure it doesn't compete with food, for example. Carbon sequestration, we think that the oil companies, both NOCs and IOCs, will have a role in injecting it into reservoirs at some point. That's a key skill. But I think we're in a 30 to 40 year long wavelength transition to lower carbon fuel. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but oil companies like ours have to be part of it for our future.
Yeah, I'll just second what Bob said. I think in the space, you need to invest in it to understand it. It's a little bit about experimentation. And in addition to Bob's comments, I think we've had a venture capital company for a number of years where we invest our capital in small pieces, less than 5% of the company's net worth, into new high-tech ventures associated with energy and also non-related technical areas, just so that we can get in and help to incubate the idea and move it. The issue is always scale. How do these opportunities scale up? And as Bob pointed out, how do we get to a world where it's not having to be subsidized to make a business model? Because in a large-scale business model, you can't really afford these subsidies to make it work out. So I think those are the things. But the growth rate is amazing. I think 1.8% in this kind of environment is a pretty high growth rate from the start that industry had.
Right. I think we're coming near the end. As the chairman, I'm going to exercise my privilege of asking the last question. And I just wanted to get back to this NOC IOC thing and asking all three of you a slightly different question. Bob and Jay, you represent companies that have dominated the industry for many decades in terms of your skills and your global reach. But as you look around and you see companies like Petrobras, CNOOC, and PetroChina moving outside of their own borders and expanding around the world, do you think you're going to be eclipsed by them in the next 10 years? And to Sami, I would ask a slightly different question and say, among the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, among the NOCs, when you look at companies like Petrobras and the same companies I've just been mentioning, seeing the way they're moving around the world, do you perhaps feel that some of your peers have perhaps been left behind in this race, if I can call it a race for global dominance? So who wants to start?
Well, I'll just start by saying I don't think we dominate anything. I think as companies, though, if you go back to 1970, when 80% of the world's resources were managed, you could say controlled or owned by the international oil companies, that number's down to 8% today. So for companies, at least like BP, I think it's probably true of Chevron and other major IOCs, to be relevant, we're going to have to operate at the envelopes and the frontiers of the industry, the deep waters, the Arctics, taking on projects like in Iraq, taking on special large reservoir issues with technology. We have legacy assets that will go on for decades, but that's where you'll see companies like us. And if we, in BP's case, if we had decided last year that deep water drilling for us is too risky, we should step back, we would become less relevant in the world. So we want to take what we've learned, keep forward, and keep working at these frontiers. And then form the partnerships with the great companies like Petrobras, who are tremendous assets in Brazil, that they're working on a huge scale, global companies. This is what happened. They're following the path of the IOCs, expanding internationally. I think you'll find a collection of companies around the world that mix their skills and unusual partnerships for decades, probably driven by those high growth rates and energy need everywhere.
Sami, do you want to follow on there?
Thank you, Carl. I don't know if it is right to call it a race, but really you will see gradually more NOCs being global or international presence. And I think it comes from the fact that the oil industry is vast, really, and to operate in different oil fields or different industries, that's certainly a strength and give you an experience. I'll give you an example for us in Kuwait. Now we are developing the heavy oil. Before we did not work. Had we had an opportunity to work in heavy oil elsewhere, it would have been easier. Similarly with the Jurassic gas. And another area is the EOR. So really being an international or global player strengthens and broadens the experience that will help the national oil companies. Thank you.
Jay?
Yeah, I think as we talk about this discussion's been happening for the last 30 or 40 years. I started in the industry and was told my career would last five years. And I've got the gray hair to prove that wasn't right. But I think when you look at it, our industry is very complex and has a lot of dimensions to it. And if you think about it, it's changed a lot through the years. And what's very important is the scale of the projects are so large now. We have over 100 projects in the queue that will cost more than $1 billion each. I quoted you the number IEA says it's going to take by 2020 for our industry to invest. It's going to take a lot of players to make that happen. We need to do that because we need all forms of energy for the growing energy demand of society. So I see, as we go forward, not the competition, but as I said in my speech, I see more collaboration now to try to get to the point where we each individually assess what our strengths are and join strength and strength together. Because there's very few places around the world we own 100% of anything. And it takes it because the risks are so high. You need to have a portfolio. As Sami just talked about, you need to have experiences in different basins that you can take to other basins and make your operation more efficient, because costs continue to go up, margins continue to go down, and you need to stay in that competitive mix. So no, I don't really see it as that competition between the IOC and NOC as much as I used to. I think it's coming back around to a much more collaborative model. But there are also a lot of very large projects for us all to manage.